Dobar dan. Da izvadimo opremu za rad. Dame I gospodo, poštovani novinari,
ladies and gentlemen, esteemed members of the press, I bid you a good day, and I welcome you to the presentation of the November inflation report. I would like to give you a short explanation first. As you see, there are no associates of ours in the audience, except those who work directly on the report. I'll be a gentleman this time and introduce the ones that are here. And the reason for this is that we wanted to invite all the press. Our associates can watch the video stream of the presentation, but we think that this time it wasn't enough to present the inflation report by just posting our speeches on the website and via the video presentation, but we wanted to be present here in person in this team, as you can see, to give all of our citizens a clear message with which I shall begin the presentation of this inflation report. It is a crisis time as regards inflation. This has become one of the main topics. And this is a kind of a tempest, I may say, but it's not a hurricane. We have been through worse. Our ship doesn't have holes, and the captain with her team has shown that she can lead the team. The National Bank of Serbia with the Serbian government that knows what it's doing and that was ready when the crisis began, much more than in the past. That's why we are here in person, and I shall now begin the formal introduction, the formal presentation to which you are accustomed and which this report is deserving of. Since our last presentation in August, the world economy was riddled by new challenges, mostly reflected in the escalating global energy crisis and prolonged disruptions in global value chains. In this sense, we can say that macroeconomic developments are under a significant impact of trends in the international environment, which are not diminishing in intensity, even in the current stage of the pandemic. While in the initial stage of the pandemic, the economic lockdown stage, we were faced with the challenge of how to preserve production capacities and jobs. In the opening stage, we need to resolve the challenge of a sudden spike in demand, limited supply of goods and services, and the ensuing rise in cost-push pressures across the globe. Over the previous days, we had an opportunity to see that in the international environment, inflation continued up in October as well. However, most central banks, including the Federal Reserve System and the European Central Bank, and also the majority of international financial institutions, agree that factors behind inflation growth are still assessed as temporary. Also, a common feature of all projections is that the expected level at which inflation will peak and then turn down is higher than previously anticipated. The main reason for this is the continued rise in global energy prices, notably oil, though this time the price of natural gas and electricity are also a factor, as they have climbed to record high levels. All of these movements also pose a challenge for the speed of global economic recovery as well. It is important to underline that the results posted by our economy show that we are responding to all of these challenges with coordinated and timely measures of the MBS as well as the Serbian government. Appropriate moves of the monetary and fiscal policies have preserved the favorable financing conditions in our country, and at the onset of the pandemic, they helped sustain the labor market and production capacities, while in subsequent stages, fiscal assistance enabled the preservation of domestic demand, as well as business and consumer confidence. Thanks to this, as of mid-last year, the Serbian economy is on a path of robust and sustainable growth. Serbia's GDP has overshot the pre-crisis level back in the first quarter and is now more than 3% above it. According to the estimate of the Serbian Statistical Office, real GDP growth in the third quarter measured 7.4% year-on-year, thus exceeding our August expectations. Growth was driven by stepped-up activity in the service and construction sectors, while good performance in mining offset the somewhat lower growth in manufacturing than expected. It is important to underline that intensive economic growth continued into the third quarter, though global movements were under a significant impact of halts in supply chains and continued growth in the global prices of primary commodities. In view of the more favorable movements in all three quarters, we raised our GDP growth forecast for this year from 6.5% to the range of 6.5 to 7%. This means that cumulatively, in 2 pandemic years, Serbia will have one of the best results in Europe in terms of economic growth. Allow me to recall that back in August, our GDP growth projection for next year was revised up to the range between 4 and 5%, which is also our expectation in the medium term. We were guided by the analysis of planned capital projects in the next 10 years in road, railway, energy and utility infrastructure, and their direct and indirect effects on other sectors of the economy. The projection has been retained, despite the fact that growth for the ongoing year was revised up. Favorable medium-term trajectory of economic growth will help sustain the increase in our citizens' living standard and convergence of our income levels to those of the European Union. As I stressed in the beginning, our current major challenge from the international environment is increased cost-push pressures stemming from the global energy market, agricultural products and processed food. In addition, cost-push pressures are also created by halts in global value chains, the lack of logistics capacity and the shortage of some raw materials, which, in conditions of stepped-up demand in the wake of the opening of most economies, leads to higher inflation rates in almost all countries and upward revisions of their projections. Still, like the majority of central banks and relevant international institutions, such as the International Monetary Fund, we estimate that these cost-push pressures are largely temporary, since they are triggered by the imbalance between supply and demand at the global level, that is, the fact that supply cannot adapt to increased demand in the short term. As demand and the gradual increase in supply normalize over the coming period, we expect cost-push pressures to go down as well. These global factors were also mirrored by inflation in Serbia. From April until July, it moved around the target midpoint, only to go up as of August and reach 6.6% year-on-year in October. The rise in inflation in the second half of the year was expected and announced in the August inflation projection. However, the seasonally uncommon rise in the prices of unprocessed food, attributable to high temperatures and the drought, as well as the unexpected further growth in global oil prices, drove inflation up to a higher level relative to the August central projection. Still, unlike the majority of other countries in the region pursuing inflation targeting, where core inflation is either around or above the upper bound of the target tolerance band in many countries, core inflation in Serbia remained in the lower part of the target band and equaled 2.7% in October. What contributed to this the most is the relative stability of the exchange rate and medium-term inflation expectations of the financial and corporate sectors anchored within the target band. According to our new central projection, we expect year-on-year inflation to temporarily move above the upper bound of the target tolerance band until mid-2022, when it will first return within the band and then go down to the lower part of the band by end year, where it will remain in 2023 as well. This will be facilitated by the expected waning of the effects of the above temporary factors, as well as the measures undertaken by the National Bank of Serbia so far towards curbing monetary accommodation. As a response to global cost-push pressures being higher than anticipated and spilling over onto the local market, the National Bank of Serbia took steps towards reducing the degree of monetary policy accommodation in order to limit the growth of inflation expectations going forward and their spillover onto the prices of other products and services. Using the flexibility of the existing monetary policy framework to change monetary conditions without changing the main interest rates, as of October, the National Bank of Serbia raised the average effective rate in auctions of the repo sale of securities by 17 basis points, hence it currently measures 0.28%. Also, repo purchase auctions of securities, which provided dinar liquidity to banks, were discontinued in October. When making these decisions, we estimated that favorable financing conditions can be maintained even at a somewhat lower degree of monetary policy accommodation, taking into account the positive effects of the prior comprehensive monetary and fiscal measures. Owing to the maintained favorable financing conditions and, at the same time, preserved quality of bank assets, lending remained an important factor ensuring growth in private investment and consumption. The volume of lending increased during the third quarter, notably to the corporate sector, which resulted in accelerated growth in overall lending to the non-monetary sector to 6.6% in September, up from 6.3% in June. Also, as the effects of the second moratorium waned off, year-on-year lending growth rate is expected to accelerate as of October. That the quality of bank assets has been preserved is best shown by the high capital adequacy as well as the share of NPLs in total loans, which is below the pre-crisis level and measured 3.55% in September. When faced with the many challenges arising from the international environment, which we also anticipate in the coming period, it is crucial that Serbia's external and fiscal positions are much better than in previous crises, which is attributable to the responsible economic policy pursued in the previous period. At present, despite the pandemic, Serbia is much better prepared for the challenges we are faced with in the international commodity and financial markets, including the monetary policy normalization of leading central banks. A significant improvement in the current account of the balance of payments and the country's fiscal position achieved in the prior years was not jeopardized even during the pandemic. The current account deficit in the 9 months of this year was around 23% lower than in the corresponding period last year and equaled 3.5% of GDP. At the same time, the export of goods rose 30.2% year-on-year and import by 24.5%. Export growth would have been even higher had there not been disruptions in global value chains, which affect activity in our key export markets, notably in Germany. We expect the share of the current account deficit in GDP to amount to around 4% this year and to between 4 and 5% in the medium term, with the full coverage by net inflows from FDI. Also, we underline that we raised the projection of this year's FDI to around 3.4 billion euros. Data for the first 10 months suggests that the FDI inflow exceeded last year's entire inflow, and that it has already amounted to more than 3 billion euros since the start of the year. To be precise, 3 billion and 185 million with the first decade of this month. It is equally important also that more than 60% of these investments is channeled to tradable sectors, which contributes to growth in export capacities of the domestic economy and is the reason why, among others, we project two-digit growth of the goods and services export in the coming years. As regards the fiscal balance, the projected deficit of 4.9% of GDP this year is more favorable than initially anticipated as a result of faster economic growth and positive labor market trends. It is expected to narrow further to 3% in 2022 and to turn into a surplus in the medium term, despite the fact that sizable funds will continue to be channeled into infrastructure projects. This will put public debt on a sustainable downward path as of next year and contain it below the Maastricht criterion. The Ministry of Finance estimates that public debt will amount to around 58% of GDP at the end of the year. In the face of all challenges, the National Bank of Serbia has managed to increase FX reserves as a guarantee of the domestic economy's stability and resilience to external shocks to record high levels. And so, since the beginning of the year, gross FX reserves of the MBS increased by 2.8 billion euros to 16.3 billion euros at end October, thus covering around 6 months' worth of the import of goods and services, which is twice higher than the reserve adequacy standard. Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, at the end of today's address, I would like to conclude that numerous challenges from the international environment are ahead of us and that the future will continue to put countries to test in terms of their readiness to face up to volatile and rather unpredictable global conditions. Economic policies able to cushion the shocks arising from energy prices and significant volatility of primary agricultural commodity prices will continue to be required. Also, overcoming the supply chain disruptions, as well as all transport logistics circumstances that burden the global economy, will continue to be a challenge. What helped us a lot in navigating this crisis is that for the past 9 years, we have incessantly worked on building and strengthening the pillars of macroeconomic stability and resilience to potential external risks. As a result, we were better prepared for the ongoing crisis, which is best illustrated by the fact that it took us only 3 quarters for GDP to return to its pre-crisis level, whereas it took several years for the economy to recover from the previous crisis. Namely, Serbia's GDP reached its pre-crisis, that is the level from Q3 2008, as late as in the second quarter of 2013, which is 18 quarters later. It is indisputable that the National Bank of Serbia cannot influence shocks from the international environment. It cannot eliminate supply halts in major world ports, nor can it establish balance or avert a rise in the global prices of oil and gas. What the National Bank of Serbia, however, can influence, and what it is profoundly committed to, together with the government, is not to allow the creation of conditions that would lead to a more persistent acceleration of inflation, as was the case in the past, and not to allow the spillover of the food and energy prices hike onto core inflation. This refers particularly to the relative stability of the exchange rate, which will be maintained going forward as well. The stability of the dinar was critical for keeping core inflation at a relatively low level, slightly above 2%, which was not the case in most of the other emerging market economies. This factor was also of paramount importance for keeping inflation expectations anchored within the target band. Let me remind you that a recent analysis of the IMF, published in the October World Economic Outlook, has shown that depreciation is the key and statistically significant factor that leads to episodes of high inflation in both emerging and advanced economies alike. As you probably know, the National Bank of Serbia has emphasized repeatedly for a number of years already that the preserved relative stability of the exchange rate plays an important role, not only in the achievement of the central bank's objectives, but also in creating favorable business and investment confidence and attracting investment to Serbia. I believe that we don't have to stress particularly what you have been able to see for yourselves over the past years, that the priority of the National Bank of Serbia's monetary policy is to deliver price and financial stability in the medium run, while supporting as fast growth of our economy and employment as possible, and contributing to further expansion of the export sector and to a favorable investment environment. We carefully weigh each decision, striving to ensure balance, because excessive tightening of financial conditions might dampen the pace of economic growth, which will be one of the key factors of success in tackling the challenges from the international environment. However, the MBS stands ready to respond promptly by all instruments on hand in case of the materialization of any of the risks that would keep inflation above the upper bound of the target band for a prolonged period of time, because low and stable medium-term inflation, along with preserved financial system stability, is the key ingredient of faster and sustainable economic growth. I thank you for your attention, and I will now give the floor to my colleagues from the Economic Research and Statistics Department to present our latest macroeconomic projections in more detail.
Thank you, Madam Governor. We shall now present to you in more detail our new macroeconomic projections of GDP and inflation and the expected movement in the key factors from the domestic and international environment. As Governor Jorgovanka Tabaković stated in her introductory address, economic activity in Serbia was more favorable than we expected in all 3 quarters of this year, which is why we revised up our GDP growth projection for 2021 from 6.5% to the range of 6.5% to 7%. Within this revised projection, we were conservative about the growth in the 4th quarter of this year, bearing in mind the current risks. In view of this, there is a possibility that GDP growth this year turns out to be even higher than currently projected. In the next year and in the medium run, we expect GDP growth rates to range between 4% and 5%. That is, we expect a model growth driven by investment and exports and supported by private consumption rising on real and sound foundations. On the production side, a positive impetus to GDP growth this year is expected from all sectors, apart from agriculture, which will most probably decline by around 5% due to the drought. On the expenditure side, we should stress the recovery of private consumption, which was hit most severely by the pandemic last year. Private consumption is expected to contribute most to GDP growth this year, owing to a further increase in wages and employment, favorable lending conditions, and fiscal incentives. We expect the contribution of private consumption to remain significant in the years to come as a result of a continued increase in employment and wages in both the private and public sector. An important source of consumption will also be higher pensions and lending activity. Although fixed investment declined only marginally last year, we expect it to rise by around 16% in real terms this year and to give a significant contribution of around 3.6 percentage points to GDP growth this year. The rise in fixed investment is supported primarily by the preserved macroeconomic stability, favorable financing conditions, and further relatively high FDI inflows projected at around 3.4 billion euros this year. Under the budget revision, government investment went up further this year to 7.8% of GDP, whereby its contribution to economic growth also increased. In the next year and in the medium run, we expect the contribution of fixed investment to economic growth to remain relatively high in light of the announced infrastructure projects, the expected continuation of robust FDI inflows and government capital expenditure. The share of fixed investment in GDP will thus exceed 25% in 2023 and continue to grow. Exports are also expected to maintain positive dynamics. Investment in earlier years increased our export supply, which, along with the normalization of global economic flows and the rebound of external demand, contributes to 2-digit export growth rates. Imports have also been picking up gradually since the 2nd quarter, notably the imports of equipment and intermediate goods owing to the continued investment cycle and, to a lesser degree, the import of consumer goods thanks to the recovery of domestic demand. With this in mind, we expect the contribution of net exports to GDP growth to be mildly negative this year. The risks to the GDP projection remain associated with the path of the pandemic and its impact on economic activity and inflation globally, including movements in commodity and financial markets. Overall, the risks are judged to be symmetric, with those from the international environment mildly tilted to the downside and those from the domestic environment slightly skewed to the upside. In terms of factors from the international environment, downside risks to our manufacturing and exports include primarily longer than expected halts in global supply chains and the continuation of the energy crisis that the world is currently facing. Consistent with the estimates of relevant international financial institutions, we assume that bottlenecks in most production sectors will be eliminated next year and that the natural gas price will begin to decline as of spring, though problems could last longer than expected. However, we wish to emphasize that owing to the underground storage in Banatski Dvor and the launch of the Turk Stream, Serbia has improved and significantly increased the safety of natural gas supply. In addition, owing to the oil-linked contracts concluded earlier with Russia, Serbia is currently paying a much lower price of gas than the market price in the rest of Europe. Although it is estimated that starting from next year the gas price will be higher for Serbia as well, it will probably stay lower than in other countries. Among domestic factors, we single out a potential sharper rise in fixed investment on account of FDI inflows and government capital expenditure, with fixed investment being the healthiest source of GDP growth as it simultaneously boosts potential output. Now, let me briefly present a new inflation projection. At this stage of the pandemic, inflation is one of the burning topics, both at home and worldwide, with the majority of central banks revising up their inflation projections. Our new inflation projection is also higher than 3 months ago. This is largely a consequence of food and petroleum product prices rising more than expected under the impact of developments in the global commodity markets and, in part, also the drought in Serbia as far as food prices are concerned. This can be corroborated by the fact that the contribution of food and energy prices to year-on-year inflation in October amounted to 4.8 percentage points of the total 6.6%, which was the inflation figure. To a lesser extent, the upward revision of the inflation projection also reflects a higher than expected rise in prices of non-food products and services under the influence of higher input and producer prices. Nevertheless, the major part of the inflation increase is still judged to be temporary in nature. According to a new projection, year-on-year inflation should reach its peak by the end of 2021 or in the first quarter of 2022. As oil, fruit and vegetable price hikes drop out from the calculation, year-on-year inflation will start to decline as of the second quarter next year. In mid-2022, it is expected to return within the target tolerance band, and by the end of the year into the lower part of the band, where it will remain in 2023 as well. The inflation decline should be mainly supported by the softening of the inflationary effect of the majority of supply-side factors related to the agricultural season and the disruptions which occurred as the global economy was exiting the pandemic, as well as the assumed resolution of the energy crisis in the global market without any major consequences for the Serbian economy. Aggregate demand is still not expected to generate any stronger inflationary pressures. The current projection of inflation and GDP is consistent with the gradual narrowing of Serbia's negative output gap, which we estimate will remain mildly negative until the end of the projection horizon. Keeping in mind this and the expected relative stability of the dinar exchange rate in the period ahead, core inflation should remain within the bounds of the target throughout the projection horizon. Uncertainty surrounding the inflation projection still generally stems from the international environment and mainly concerns the speed of the global economic recovery and the length of delays in the global supply chains, movement of global prices of energy and primary agricultural commodities, as well as the normalization of monetary policies of leading central banks. Risks to the projection are, in smaller part, also related to the domestic environment, primarily the next agricultural season, the dynamics of domestic demand and movement of administered prices. While there is a probability that the expected stabilization and a gradual decline in global prices of oil and primary agricultural commodities might not take place as we assumed in this projection based on futures, and as is assumed and projected by the relevant international institutions, the increase of these prices by around 70% and 40% respectively, which is an average to be recorded this year, could hardly be repeated next year. In any case, it is almost certain that the profile of inflation will be just as we described, that is, that it will decline as of the second quarter, and that it will be at the level of target midpoint towards the end of the year. Ladies and gentlemen, to conclude today's speech, I would like to point out that the November inflation report includes 5 text boxes covering current topics. In the first text box, we explain the causes behind the current inflation rise. The second text box offers the analysis as to how the normalization of monetary policies of leading central banks could reflect on Serbia's private sector debt. The third text box analyzes the growth prospects of the Central and Southeast European region, which gains in importance as our foreign trade partner. The fourth text box is devoted to the main challenges facing monetary policies of emerging economies, including Serbia, in the period ahead. In the fifth text box, we assess the role of the banking sector in the financing of economic growth and the potential consequences of lawsuits concerning bank fees for financial and macroeconomic stability. Thank you for your attention. We are now open for your questions. Dragice.
Marija Mitrović-Artes. Maybe a longer question, but I want to be very specific in what I want to ask. Since 2013, it's been stable as regards inflation, and now after 8 years, we are again faced with something that looks like inflation. But now, do your analysis include the psychological moment? Because we can see that people have been psychologically starting to calculate some higher rates of some prices like petrol and oil and gas into the product prices based on previous experiences from some previous years, because we are still using gas at the price of around $200, although yesterday's price was $1,100. And you also mentioned as an important factor growth in private consumption. But if the psychological moment continues of prices going up more than the actual inflation, and we wonder whether citizens will be reluctant to save their money. So have you analyzed this situation and this psychological moment? Thank you. Thank you for your question. You know, some people see the economics as a science, others question whether it's a science. If, for instance, in this area and in many others, if you're guided by expectations, which are sometimes rational, sometimes inexplicable and irrational, which means that we can't disregard the psychological moment, but the question is whether and how can we measure this psychological moment. The advantage of these people sitting here with me and my personal advantage is experience that we have behind us. You know, our Nikola Dragašević, who is General Manager of the Monetary and FX Operations Department, and he is one of the youngest among us. For him, inflation is a phenomenon that he tracked through literature. And he can think about inflation in terms of being slow, for which Christine Lagarde is accused of, or the other end, which is called panic. But as long as he has such captain on his ship, all of us who have lived through this inflation and who know the structure of that inflation, the reasons why it occurred, why it was created, we cannot underestimate the psychological moment, but we also don't want to overestimate it. In everything that I have done, explaining my 9 years at the head of the bank, where quite by accident, I had prepared for my whole life. In all of the books, we have the illustration of that banknote of Jovan Jovanović Zmaj with all those zeros, and a memory of a worker at the teller who loved me and who ran to give me my salary first so that I can buy at least 5 or 6 German marks for those few banknotes that I got for my salary. However, fear should be an ally in our life and not something that freezes us and prevents us from being active. We want to say to the people that with our experience, we know what the psychological expectations are and what are the limits within which the National Bank of Serbia can have any impact. We talked about core inflation and not spilling inflation over onto those prices. And so I'm used to speaking in examples. I hope you won't take this amiss. I don't want to, although I'm a governor, I want to speak openly and even mention some specific names. I want to explain to you this psychological moment, or actually, as you would say, finding something in muddy waters. The government restricted the price of bread, and that's what the government was supposed to do. But I can speak about my own case, by my own example. 2 weeks ago, on the 31st of October, 2021, I bought coffee, the one that I like, Don Cafe Strong, and the price of 200 grams was 239.99 dinars for 200 grams. Here's the receipt as proof. Only 2 weeks later, I asked my friend, because she went out, I asked her to buy coffee for me. She came and brought me the receipt. That same bag of coffee was 369 dinars. Yes. Yes, shortages and everything, but the increase from 239 to 369 dinars, it's impermissible. We cannot have that. And so, my advice to citizens as to behavior, which we have even with banking offers, is the following. The very same day when I did my purchase, I checked the website and I saw that the coffee goes from 234, it's the same brand of coffee, from 234 dinars to 374. You can see the names of all supermarkets, the franchises, because these are public data. So the same bag of coffee at the same time, its price ranges from 234 to 374 dinars. I put my friend in an unpleasant situation. She went back to the shop and she took a picture of the coffee stalls in the supermarket on the 14th of November, and she said, I thought I was strict at the checkout maybe, although it was the same coffee, but she went there and saw that indeed the coffee did cost that much, that in another shop it was available for purchase at a lower price. So this is not a psychological moment. This is a moment in which the participants in the private life in Serbia are not all equally aware that the current and petty benefits cause much bigger damage. The supermarket selling coffee today for 369 dinars, while in another supermarket you can buy it for 239 dinars. That first supermarket owner forgets the basic tenet which made Walmart the main retail chain in America. They said their employees, we are not hiring you as sellers, us, I mean we as owners and shareholders, but the buyers, the customers are the ones who are hiring you. So you have to be kind and polite to them, and also the second factor is the price at which we sell our goods. So whether and for how long these supermarkets intend to remain here by behaving like this, muddying the waters, trying to create a spiral of inflation, this isn't just an interesting illustration for this press conference. This is proof that those who perceive the world from a selfish world point and see only one segment don't realize that this is a boomerang that will come back to them through unjustly high prices of raw materials or others. It's the same situation with construction materials and many other items, but we must admit that there is a situation where no one is either ready. I mean, nobody expects us to go below the production price of some products, so we know the actual costs. At the previous meeting of the executive board, we talked about, for instance, one of the most favorable retail chains, and we asked, we said, we know that you have long queues and low margins, but how do you estimate further price hikes? And they say, we have direct offers of agricultural products from the producers, from farmers, so no intermediaries there. But everything else that, because you need to pack the product into something, into plastics, into cardboard, plastic granules have gone up. All the prices of packaging have gone up. So these hikes will continue for as long as these bottlenecks open, that is, until they become open value and supply chains, and that is why we think that these effects are temporary, and that none of these, whom I have called out through the coffee price, which coffee isn't bread, but it's very often bought by our citizens, so they have to be aware that this is indeed a situation, a tempest-like situation, though not a hurricane yet. So they have to face the fact that turnover in their shops, in their markets, will decline, and it cannot be compensated by such high prices of some products. Because, like we always do, we publish everything on our website. We publish the prices of banking services, so we can do the same with product prices. Everyone believes that inflation is a monetary phenomenon by definition, and simply put, it's excess money in circulation. However, how big is that surplus money was over the past 2 decades that was created by the printing of money, by various creative ideas by central banks that were trying to trigger inflation. But there was no inflation. What does this mean? It's very important where this surplus money issued by large central banks through various instruments, where it has ended up. Mostly in financial markets, and so we had the situation of the negative price of money, and I shall quote one of the current economists, John Malden, that I like. He said that if time is money, then interest rate is the price of time. Can time be so worthless to be valued by a negative interest rate, and that is to make it an expense? No, it cannot, but the excess amount of money which ended up in financial markets, where competitors purchased their competition, creating monopolies and cartels, where they purchased their own shares, withdrew from stock exchange markets, they all led to the situation that they may try to dictate the prices of these goods that I'm speaking about. However, at some point, just like the pandemic, all of these pre-crisis all these magical bank products will be paid for later. Just as the pandemic showed that you cannot just sever the tie between China and America because of their mutual interdependence. You cannot, when you have a globalized world, you cannot go back. So the interconnectedness of financial markets of production markets, production that was outsourced to China. You cannot just threaten not to deliver technology to China, but then you have a boomerang of a lack of chips and halts in production, in the production of your goods. All of these things in the pandemic actually surfaced to the degree in which we, I can say quite innocent, also have the same situation now, because we never went, we always took great care, even when they said public debt is not important, just help the economy. As the state, we took care of the level of public debt. When they said inflation isn't important, we did take care of the inflation. And that is why today we can speak about inflation that has been imported, and, for instance, agricultural products were not imported, but they have the global stock exchange price, and our producers don't sell their wheat, for instance, but waiting for better conditions to sell their goods for a higher price. Some of these goods can be kept for a long time, some cannot, but what is important is that we all have to be aware that Serbia has its own specificities, that we have retail chains here from all parts of the world, but that as consumers, we are not just victims of monopoly and cartel-like behavior. We are also those who are feeding the monopolies and cartels by buying goods from them. My advantage is that I never forgot that I'm just a common citizen like everyone else, and that even though I sit here as a governor, I also have to take care of the life of each of our citizens by not allowing, to the degree that it's possible from these positions, I will not allow our citizens to be victims. They say the prices are growing everywhere, why are we any different? But I'm telling you, they can go up only to the measure that it is justified, and that measure is as much as you can track global growth and halts that we mentioned, and increases in the prices of raw materials used for the products that are manufactured here in Serbia. How can we affect this psychology? For instance, here I'm looking at you in your eye, and I'm explaining to you how much effort are we investing in tracking these models, but we can also invite everyone, just like what the McKinsey Global Institute, what they did, and they scheduled an internal roundtable and invited central banks to observe their performance and their contribution to economic growth through balance sheet.
Let me explain what this means. They only gave one instruction to the central bank, which is supposed to attend, and the National Bank of Serbia should never be invited to such roundtable discussion, because the National Bank of Serbia precisely knows its balance sheet, as does the government of Serbia, which knows very well its balance sheet. And here we have a basic balance sheet, which is studied in the secondary school of economics, and this is the list of what we have and how we provided that. These assets mean a list of what is available to us: land, facilities, material investment, tangible investment. What are your assets? What is available to you? Materials, semi-products, finished products, claims and cash. What are the sources of your funds? What are your liabilities? Own capital, long-term loans, then long-term loans divided into fixed assets and working assets. So long investment projects and the spending that the government must have, because the government does not produce but spends, and short-term liabilities, suppliers, banks and other. If you look at this home budget, your own balance sheet in the National Bank, your balance in the government, you begin to understand the story of GDP, because in GDP you have included all these items from assets. This is currently a low deficit, which we expect to turn into a surplus. Materials, semi-products, commodity reserves, infrastructure projects, facilities, plants, investments. This is what we have at our disposal, the government, the National Bank, and the citizen. What are your liabilities, your obligations? These are your obligations, which you have through what you inherited and created, through long-term loans and through short-term loans, but also the liabilities through which the government of the Republic of Serbia responds in due time. And this is why it is a favorable, attractive investment destination, and the National Bank of Serbia in its balance sheet does not have a single item which could be designated as an uncautious investment decision or monetary financing, God forbid. Because in my life and in my work, I am guided by a key principle of caution. All costs should be considered as certain and due, despite their maturity, regardless of their maturity, and all gains should only be deemed real when they are in your account. That is the kind of responsibility with which we are working and with which we are producing these projections. This is the kind of responsibility with which we respond to journalists' questions regarding our projections, regarding our work, regarding our lending activity, attitude towards banks, any reports submitted and analyzed by us very carefully. This can be confirmed by Sava, who last night, together with Nicola, was working with me online until midnight, until we analyzed an item that we received from banks, which was, so to say, kind of grayish and unclear, and that we were trying to clarify. The attention and the seriousness with which we approach each our task, and our understanding that this symbol of the National Bank of Serbia, we are celebrating our 137th anniversary this year, and that this symbol of the National Bank of Serbia is binding for us all, and we are sure that the confidence which citizens have in the National Bank of Serbia, and which has been proven by our tasks through the relative stability, where I say that we're trying to meet the interests of all creditors, lenders, savings depositors, importers, exporters. This stability is something that we must all work on, and no one should look at their selfish interests alone, because any kind of selfishness will turn into a boomerang for the person engaging in such behavior, and then for all of us as well. I did not think that the past inflation could be repeated. But I just wanted to say that some producers are calculating higher costs than should be calculated. There is no need to justify your question. Inflation in many countries is higher than 30 years back. There is fear in Germany, fear in America. It is a key topic at this point, inflation. It is a key topic everywhere, because what is our objective? Our objective is not to tax citizens through inflation. Tax should be tax and inflation. Not every inflation is a serious illness. A bit of inflation is good and stimulating, and that is why we have numerical targets that are even encouraging some inflation. But it is very important not to succumb to panic, but also no business entity should engage in actions that cannot end up well. I would say this anyway. We will do everything to prevent this from happening, and I'm sure that those people who are following the work of the National Bank of Serbia believe seriously in this, because there is a Roman statement. Unfortunately, time has made it very topical, where someone is not said to have passed away, but he has lived. This is, I'm acting in line with this statement, because I want to be measured by the results that I have achieved as governor, and I hope that these, my young colleagues, will have opportunities to make good and useful moves to that end. Savage from Bloomberg Agency. Over the past 10 days, we have had two new events. The National Bank became a net seller of foreign exchange in the interbank market, which is the first time since January, which points to a need to defend the dinar, but in the opposite direction than for the most part of the year. And the second thing happened yesterday, that there were no offers in the auctions of dinar bonds, which some people in banks interpret as a consequence of inflation expectations and expectations that the National Bank of Serbia will change its key policy rate. So these are two new things: pressure on the dinar, but on the other side, depreciation instead of appreciation pressures. And this thing that has not happened since the Public Debt Directorate was founded, that there were no offers at all. I will start and then maybe leave Nicola to add something. A question for the Public Debt Directorate. If no one appeared in this reopening of the dinar bond, I would like to ask them why they came out with this auction. So this is a question for them. But when it comes to depreciation pressures, November is the month. It is the month of November. It is the end of the year. And the reasons why we have such pressures include the payment of dividends of companies which, through banks, appear in the interbank foreign exchange market with requests to buy foreign exchange and pay out the dividends to their non-resident owners. So this is mostly the reason. So the match between FX supply and demand has returned to the seasonal impact which happens late in the year when we have increased payouts of dividends from the real sector, mostly, but also from the financial sector, where we are trying to a degree to agree in which way this will happen in order to match foreign exchange supply and demand, in order for the market not to feel this. So this is not unexpected. It is certainly not unexpected. But what is unexpected is that at the same time you have an increase in the price of gold and in the price of the US dollar. This never happened, and now it is happening. So many of the phenomena are very unusual, but they can also be explained. If Janet Yellen says that a change in the projection or the recovery in the labor market or the impact of inflation will depend on the fight against the pandemic, this means that in the pandemic you have a flight to safe haven, to safe assets, to safe havens. I'm trying to be clear. So you have the buying of US dollars, of gold. It is very current, but it is an unusual situation. The same way as yesterday, Nicola can explain, we had a very unusual situation with the volatility of gas prices, which are guided by political decisions, but on which option traders are making very good and serious money. So there has always been speculation, but no one should be worried about this part of interventions in the interbank FX market, because the National Bank of Serbia has created sufficient reserves for these times, and It is a part of what is natural, but also a part of what we have studied through Brexit, through the Greek crisis that we have weathered, the first arrangement with the International Monetary Fund, which was not easy, when we had to listen carefully, monitor carefully, take care of some numerical obligations in relation to FX reserves, interventions in the market. So we are among those who are buying when they can and not when they have to, which is shown not only by the high level of FX reserves, which have been provided in the cleverest possible way by buying the euros when their supply was highest. So today we are able to intervene the same way as in October 2019. And in 2020, we bought gold, the price of which is rising and which provides additional safety and security in these times of crisis, when we can say that we have marketable gold bars that we can some people say, what is the purchase of gold? Just a change of one type of foreign exchange reserves from one form to another. But this is not the same thing. There was a time when we took in cash into the country, so that it would be not a cost for us if it is kept abroad, because keeping funds abroad in euros meant negative interest. We only kept transaction deposit accounts only in as much as was necessary for the government to make its payments through corresponding banks. But we structured our assets to spend least and to provide maximum security. 140 million is something that is not a big amount of sold euros for the stability which we have, and which for all of us working here and planning to come should convince them that Serbia will remain a favorable investment destination. Nicola, would you like to add something?
No, I didn't say it's a problem, but Željko has an important thing to do. Darko, please come and sit here. He's in the supervision department, general manager. Instead of the vice governor, he will join us here. Željko has to go to do something nice, but he wants to be with us here today. Go ahead. I didn't say this is a problem. I'm just asking about the implications of these two moments. Inflation is obviously an important factor because there was no offers at the auction yesterday, at least that's how they perceive it. I'm not saying they're right. I even heard comments from bankers who say that they were wrong for not giving offers. But I'm just interested in implications for you, for the monetary policy, and for the the upcoming decision-making time as to the key policy rate. Are these some new moments in your thinking? I can only say what I have already said. This is a good occasion. So people are making money in Serbia, earning money in Serbia. There are dividends that's being paid out, and that's why we had depreciation pressures because of the payout of the dividends, which is usual for this time of the year. The second part, regarding the decision of the Public Debt Administration to go out to the auction without preparing it in advance, is a question for them. So we really don't think that this has anything to do with the measures that we undertake or that we will undertake. What else can I add? In 2012, on the 19th of December, for the first time, we introduced auctions where, on a weekly level, we resolved excess liquidity, but not as had been done until then, by accepting everything that the banks offer, which was the status quo when we came there, and the excess was paid to them, the excess that they just placed with the MBS at the price of the key policy rate that was 8.75 at the time, which meant a great expense for the state, not just for the MBS. But we established a system of the so-called variable auctions where we estimate what the excess is, banks give us their offer, and we decide whether we will accept something and how much of that excess we will keep at a weekly level. These repo auctions, weekly auctions, led to an instantaneous fall in the key policy rate by 2.5%, 2.5 basis points. So today we are talking about the key policy rate that's 1%, and we are not raising it because we have this auxiliary instrument called the executive interest rate at repo auctions on Wednesdays, once a week, that was lifted from 0.11 to 0.27%. And until it comes to the same level as the key policy rate, we don't need to raise the key policy rate, because that would mean, obviously, a tightening of monetary conditions and a more difficult access to financial assets, both for corporates and households. And how can we expect economic growth in such a situation, and growth that's not just a metric data, but it's actually something that tells us that behind those assets you have quite concrete facilities, services, and what the government is providing. So the GDP, that is our objective, one of the objectives, where the MBS also helps the government's economic policy. We must never forget our two main objectives, of course, financial stability as number 2 and price stability as number 1. But this is also an objective because it tells us that GDP is not just a number. Those are jobs, wages, healthy demand for goods that is produced and sold by those who produce and sell goods. I always say that I have this ideal that knowledge in itself is not much. It's just potential, but somebody needs to be given an opportunity to show the knowledge. But not knowledge is the same. Knowledge has to be useful, has to be applicable, just like production and services have to be really needed by someone so that they can give their hard-earned money for those products and services. So it is our goal to work and earn, and in that way to encourage what is called sustainable growth, where each of us will have a valorization of our efforts and our work and what we have invested in this. So we are not worried by this. We are wondering a little bit, just like you are. I can't guess the reason. I don't like anyone to interfere in my work, so I don't like to interfere in other people's work, but I like to talk and to hear criticisms, because, you know, without those who keep asking questions, who keep presenting you another point of view, without even rivals or enemies, you cannot grow. You need challenges to be able to perceive the situation from the best point of view. So I'm grateful when somebody asks us, when somebody gives us advice, if it's meaningful, of course, but I don't interfere into other people's work, so I'm guessing they know why they came out without any requests. We also wonder. Okay. Slađana Garić, 24/7 portal. You mentioned that the National Bank of Serbia would react with all available instruments if inflation kept above 4.5% for a longer period of time. So which would be a longer term? Is it 3 months or 6 months? That's first question. And the second is, what would be the first moves that the MBS would undertake in such situation? We certainly hope that your projection materializes, but as to the monetary policy horizon and deadlines, Savo can tell you, or Nikola can also jump in later to tell us about the measures, though I've mentioned them already. We agreed that that they should do most of the responses, but I haven't seen you in a while, so.
Thank you. As we presented in our speeches, in the governor's speech and in my speech, this inflation projection is the central projection. So there are risks that are currently present. We certainly have a degree of uncertainty worldwide, but what our central projection shows is that inflation in the next quarter, in the first quarter of the next year, will remain above the target, that towards mid-year it will retreat within this range, 3% plus minus 1.5 percentage points, and it will continue to decline till the end of the year. At the end of the year, we expect it to be around the target midpoint, around 3%, and remain at that level in 2023. So in our inflation report, you have the fan chart. Maybe we can show it. It depicts the probabilities that the model produces of deviations from the central projections. But in view of the current assumptions and expectations on the basis of futures and some developments and what other international financial institutions are projecting, so this is our central projection. This is the darkest line that you can see here. Your question was, what would that mean if it did not come within the target tolerance band? Extended duration of this inflation level above the target midpoint, if it were extended in the second half of the next year, that would be something that we did not expect in this central projection. Nikola, perhaps you can add what Jessica has said. We have different questions on this topic, where we are advised by different institutions and analysts, where through this advice we're actually being requested a certain level of the key policy rate, but also there are those whose advice we read very gladly, and those whom we appreciate very much, such as JP Morgan and our Jessica, who is considering these circumstances in the right way. JP Morgan is certainly one of the institutions which is the most objective in its analysis of Serbia's monetary policy. In all their reports, they do not consider only monetary developments, but overall macroeconomic developments, which is very important in order not to focus on one segment only. As the government has repeatedly pointed out, there is a high level of interconnection in the economy, while real flows affect monetary flows. When it comes to the instruments that are available for us, we first have to ask the question of what causes inflationary pressures. Are the supply side or demand side pressures, and monetary policy instruments, central banks instruments, whether they can respond to that. We have seen that a bulk of inflation, since it has since inflation rates have begun to rise, has been imported from abroad. So it is global in character. And these are mostly supply-side factors to which the central bank cannot respond very much for the greatest part. The central bank can influence inflation expectations, and we intend to do this through the stability of the exchange rate, which has been maintained for the past 9 years. We also, on many occasions, communications, we have also mentioned that there is no alternative to this. I would also like to add that in this year we net bought 960 million, so almost €1 billion. So appreciation pressures are still prevailing if we take into account the euro as a whole. So this seasonal character that has been mentioned by the governor in relation to depreciation pressures is not something that causes concern, but something that we entirely expected in view of the arrival of the new winter season, the elevated price of energy products that are imported in this part of the year. When it comes to other instruments that are available to us, the National Bank of Serbia has already begun giving signals, and as the governor has pointed out in our press release after the executive board meeting, we mentioned that we'll promptly, without delay, apply all instruments. The second step was that we discontinued, as of 7th October, the organizing of repo auctions injecting dinner liquidity, which was provided to the banking sector at very favorable terms in the past period. A higher excess liquidity is now being withdrawn through one-week repo auctions. In the prior period, this was largely left to the banking sector through the excess deposits, through what is available to them on an overnight basis every day. Now this percentage of withdrawal of liquidity, that is of excess liquidity through repo, has increased significantly. Let me give you an example. In September, in the September calculation period last year, through repo auctions, 8% of excess liquidity was withdrawn. Now 46% is withdrawn in the current period. So this is another indicator of how, by using measures that we announced, by influencing liquidity conditions, we are also influencing the reduction in the accommodation of monetary policy. The governor has repeatedly pointed out through the repo rate, which is the executive rate. We will have it today because we are having a repo auction today. It increased from 0.11 to 0.28, and this is a feature of the monetary framework of the National Bank of Serbia. If you allow me, one country has recently highlighted a similar principle. We are not trying to say that they are copying us or that they are in any way taking similar steps, but definitely after several months, Hungary announced yesterday there is a possibility for it to use its deeper rate without changing its main rate, which would mean something that is completely analogous to what the National Bank of Serbia is doing. So without changing the corridor of main interest rates, it is tightening monetary conditions, that is monetary policy conditions. Of course, if over a longer time period these inflation pressures persist and prove out to be persistent and not transitory and longer term, we have available the change in the corridor, in the key policy rate. But as Governor has already emphasized, for as long as we have the space to use the repo rate as the instrument, the key policy rate need not be changed. Darko Stamenkovic made a joke about Hungarians and said that we would not talk about copyright. Now, let this be just an example of the taking over of a good practice. Because this allows us to respond promptly on a weekly level and not wait for the executive board meeting, which is held once a month. So until mid next year, if the pandemic situation calms down, we definitely expect from the second half of the year for inflation to return within the corridor. If this does not happen, we will not refrain from taking other measures, such as the increase in the key policy rate, because this rate has this purpose. But our key goal is to maintain stability, but also to encourage economic growth.
If there are no more questions, I would like to thank you for your attention, and I thank my associates. Milan, there were no questions for you this time. You have convinced everyone that export is growing despite the stable exchange rate. Thank you all.